Hi, everyone. My name is Margo Lindauer. I am a current professor of law and former director of the Domestic Violence Institute at Northeastern University School of Law. Welcome to my new YouTube channel. Some of you may know me as one half of the Just Us podcast pair. And we have received some feedback and some interest around certain legal cases and legal analysis that might not be appropriate for our Just Us podcast channel, but we thought maybe would be appropriate for a newer channel for those of you who are interested in learning more about legal cases, what's going on in the news, and just hearing perspective of someone who has taught law for the last 15 or so years. The jury is deliberating on the Karen Read case. And while I can't opine whether they're going to find her guilty or not guilty, I think this case is fascinating and disturbing for a whole slew of reasons. One, of course, the tragic death of someone, to the really troubled investigation, where there were clearly mishandlings of both evidence, procedure, and protocol. Some aspects of this case that I haven't heard spoken about are more kind of within my wheelhouse. I was not a criminal lawyer per se, though domestic violence and SA often go hand in hand with the criminal process. So I'm very familiar with the process that Karen Read and the court is kind of going through. But what I haven't heard and is so troubling to me are some of the aspects of this case that have been quite normalized. And those include, but are not limited to, kind of the pervasive drunk driving on everyone's part, including Karen Read, including all of the police officers, all of the people who were at that bar, who went back to the after party. Everyone acknowledged that they imbibed heartily, and everyone also acknowledged that they drove. And driving under the influence in Massachusetts and other places is a crime and puts people at very high risk of harm, including the driver, but often it's not the driver who's harmed, it's often someone else. And in this case, it's alleged that Karen Read killed her then boyfriend and also was intoxicated at the time of the alleged incident. But we have heard from many police officers and many people who were involved with those two people that day that people were driving while under the influence and then continue to drink and then drive again and even drive to the police station and go to work. And what I haven't heard said, but maybe it has been said, is that this is not acceptable. While I have no opinion or no judgment about what people do on their own time or how they choose to engage in social events, I do have a real problem with people putting other people's lives at risk. And this idea that just because someone potentially is involved or adjacent to law enforcement, therefore getting a green light or somehow not having to follow the rules that all of us have to follow, is very, very problematic. I don't know if folks are talking about, but it certainly hasn't been mentioned kind of specifically, is how deeply unhealthy the relationship between the victim in this case and the defendant in this case was. Many people testified to the defendant here kind of having a really loud outbursts while on vacation in Aruba, among many other people. We heard many text messages between the two parties being read at the trial that shows kind of ongoing tension and fighting. And while I can't opine on what was happening kind of specifically in the case, as someone who has worked with a lot of people in unhealthy relationships, what I can tell you is that not all unhealthy relationships are abusive, but all abusive relationships are unhealthy. And so I think a reasonable person could come to the conclusion that this relationship, this romantic relationship, was quite obviously unhealthy. They were fighting constantly. They were calling each other terrible names. We saw on the stand one of the victim's friends admitting to flirting with the victim's girlfriend, the defendant in this case, also a deeply unhealthy behavior, no matter what sort of relationship they had, right? Kind of against all social codes of respect for friends. And we we saw kind of recently, the night of the alleged incident, the defendant calling the victim kind of horrible names, calling him a P name, kind of calling, oh, also the kind of incessant calling up to 50 times. Now, I know that a lot of technological behavior has become normalized because many of us have smartphones and people have Find Your iPhone or kind of other tracking devices that they share with loved ones. But what I would say is that there is a lot of the behavior in this case that is not normal, that bridges on stalking-like, that certainly bridges on emotional abuse. And no one is talking about that. Now, I don't know, I'm not saying that it's motive or not motive for a crime, but it certainly kind of gives the picture of a deeply unhealthy relationship, and one that maybe the parties were trying to extract themselves from, but like certainly hadn't at the time of the death. I think it's really interesting because as of the taping of this, the jury has been deliberating for over a day. And a lot of the defendant's supporters, the Karen Read supporters, those who vehemently believe she is innocent, also believed that there would be a not guilty finding immediately, right? That the jury would go back, sift through the evidence together or talk about the evidence together, and that there would be a unanimous feeling that this person was set up and that she was not guilty of a crime. Now, that has not happened. That doesn't mean that they are not going to find her not guilty. To be found guilty of a crime, the state or the Commonwealth in this case has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person in question committed the crime in question. Now, Karen Read was charged with lots of offenses. Many people believe that she was overcharged, meaning that she was charged with offenses that the Commonwealth clearly could not prove. I'm not opining on that right now. However, there were also lesser and included charges within the charging document. So she theoretically could be found not guilty on everything, or could be found not guilty on some of the charges and guilty on others. What I'm going to talk about is kind of what likely will happen. One, the jurors could unanimously find her guilty of some or all of the charges. Another option is that they find her unanimously not guilty, and she walks out a free woman. The third, which potentially is quite possible, is that the jury can't come to a consensus, and that's called a hung jury. In that case, she likely will walk out of the courtroom a free woman, but the Commonwealth can bring the charges again. Either the same charges, different charges, lesser and included charges. And the longer a jury deliberates, the more the possibility of a hung jury. So we don't know what's going to happen. Your guess is as good as mine. This case has garnered a lot of local and national attention. I am just one voice and certainly not the expert on this case. There are people that are deeply invested in the outcome for reasons that I understand and many reasons that I don't understand. But it certainly has opened a conversation here in the Commonwealth about what happens when crimes happen within the orbits of different law enforcement individuals, and do those individuals get different treatment than lay civilians? My instinct is that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has made the point that they believe that the person who killed John O'Keefe is Karen Read. I would find it highly unlikely that they would bring new charges against one of their own, but I could be wrong. I'm Margo Lindauer, and that's the law.